Alright, g'day everyone, and welcome to a Dominions 5 strategy video. I know it's been a while. I changed over computers, and in so doing, I wrecked my filing system for all of my Dominion save files. They're all still there, they're just horribly jangled. And after all these weeks of trying to sort them out, I was like, you know what? I'm going to do a guide video while I get my games back in order and start my upload schedule again. So what I wanted to talk about today was continuing on from a series I started before, which was the topic of ritual spells, targeted ritual spells. And we already dealt with the topic of army killers, which is where you quite legitimately, in the context of war, use magic to attack enemy combatants, enemy army personnel, to destroy their troops and their mages and help you win the war. But Dominions is sometimes a dark game as well as a high fantasy game. So of course, people in the Dominions universe find ways to use spells not just against enemy armies, but against enemy population centers. And today I want to cover ritual spells, which allow you to attack not armies, but provinces. So, what I'm going to do, I'm going to talk a little bit about the high-level strategy of these spells. When might you use them? When wouldn't you use them? Where do you see them? Where do you not see them? Just in general terms. I'm going to take you through, as you can see on screen, a couple of the classes of the spells that you unlock in this category to illustrate where there's value, where there might not be value, how you might use them. And then we're going to make some additional findings at the end, take into account what we've heard about spells, what are the standouts, how might you want to use them in the game. So, first things first, let's think about the concept of using ritual magic to attack a province. That is, you're spending gems and a mage, and possibly research, depending on your goals, in order to target an enemy province, and in some way, make it worse. We're going to cover some of the ways in which you can make a province worse, but the general theme is that you're making it less productive, either temporarily or permanently. This has certain advantages. It allows you to directly impact your enemy's economy at a conceptual level, either through the gold they're earning or through the recruitment of units. It lets you hurt these enemies' economy even in provinces that you can't get an army into. And secondly, it lets you hurt a province that if you raided, you couldn't keep. Well, if you just kill the population there, you've done the damage is persistent. There's two problems with this, however. It doesn't, in the short term, help you win a war. Usually, a lot of the time, we'll talk about where there's an exception to that. Because even though you've killed your enemy's economy in the long term, if in the short term they still have their army and they're using their gems to defeat your army and you lose, well, congratulations. You can be a little spiteful knowing that you've hurt the enemy economy going forward. But what you haven't succeeded in doing is winning your immediate war. So that's one part of the problem. These spells are more long-term than short-term. And that is actually the same problem that informs the second part, which is that you're destroying the potential spoils of a war. People don't like attacking Ermor or the other popular nations because there's nothing of value in their lands. Well, if you nuke the enemy homeland too hard, then you're taking away from the gains that you would get from those lands were you to take that from them. So for that reason, you don't seem to see province attack spells used a huge amount at some levels of the game. Another thing to note just at the top is that the impact these spells have, almost uniformly, scales inversely with the size of the opposing empire. Which means the smaller your opponent is, the more damaging hurting one of their provinces is likely to be. Unlike globals like Utter Dark, which nuke all the provinces and thus don't care how big an empire is, these spells affect the enemy based on how many provinces they have as a proportional share. It also means that they almost always are used to target capitals. These spells, except for the temperature spells, are usually used to nuke capitals and very, very high income provinces in order to be worth it. But of course, nuking them means that you don't get full value from them if you later on take them. So, those are some initial observations. I'm going to add one more in, and that is that there are diplomatic purposes for using each and every one of, well, not each and every one of it. Most of these spells can have a diplomatic purpose, and it gets particularly pertinent when you start talking about some of the anonymous spells which occur at the end of this chain. But we'll get to that and talk about some of the horrible things that you can do to the right of the screen. So let's go through and talk about some of the classes of spells that are in this category, go through them, discuss the pros and cons, and then having gone through them, we can sort of shape our strategy a little more beyond just those points I raised at the start. Okay, so on the left here, I've gone temperature control spells, low-level unrest spells, messing with their scale spells, high-level unrest spells, and nukes. Great. Let's deal with each of these in order. At the start, Woven Winter and Breath of the Desert don't actually damage a province that much. That's not true. Woven Winter does kill population, a small amount of population when you use it. What both of these do is they bump the temperature scale 3 points in one direction or the other. Woven Winter bumps a province 3 cold from wherever it is. Breath of the Desert bumps it 3 heat. However, scales do apply in the same terms, so you may actually only end up bumping the scales 2 points because you might knock it 2, and then their Dominion might drag it 1 the other way. The other thing to note mechanically about this is these temperature changes happen after combat, so you can't cast Woven Winter and move your giants in on the same turn and have them benefit from ice protection. Doesn't work. You need to Woven Winter the turn before you go in. But why might you use this in a province destroying sense? Well, if a nation has a temperature scale and its province get bumped to the opposing temperature scale, then its income can get reduced. And this is one of those rare exceptions to the rule that you're destroying a province that you might later benefit from, in that if you are a cold preference nation and you are attacking Abyssia and you Woven Winter their capital down to neutral scales or even cold 3 before you move in, not only will it make the battle easier, not only will it reduce their income while you're moving in, but it means you're actually going to have your full income quicker when you move in. So in that sense, it's a very narrow province damaging spell. It's a temporary nuke on the ability of your opponent to earn a living. It has a particular use in the late age, which I'll flag here. If you are facing up against Raga, Raga can only recruit their elite sacreds, their Griffin Rider companions, the Jaedens, in heat scales. This is a good example. So if you Woven Winter their capital down cold, they lose access to their good units. So there are narrow cases in which controlling the temperature of the province that you're operating in might affect recruitment. It also affects incomes. The problem is the cost to impact on gold is usually quite high. You're spending a lot of gems in Woven Winter for a temporary income debuff. So I would usually only advise using these if it's also got a really big impact on your battle. If you're playing Late Age Atlantis, for example, Woven Wintering the enemy capital, if they are a heat preference nation, let's just say they're Satis, actually. Satis is a good example because the enemy has cold-blooded. Not only are you nuking his income in the meantime, you're meaning that when you go to battle, you have more protection and they have higher fatigue. So and that you get more income when you take the province after you take it, which you're more likely to do because you're fighting in favorable climates. So these are not really province damaging spells strictly. They do a little bit of damage. They're mostly about coaching battles that take place in those squares, but I've included them because they technically have an anti-economy role, and they're worth covering in this context. The next category, which you get at Alt 4 for Blight and Evo 4 for Hurricane. So one is a Death Earth crosspath and one is just A3. Your first of what is the general theme, what most people think of when they think of province nukes, which is a combination of unrest and population kill. Unrest has two functions. It has a pretty steep impact on tax revenues, and forces the enemy to kill population if they want to patrol that unrest away quickly. And secondly, if your unrest crosses 100, you cannot recruit in a province, which means a capital with 100 unrest is costing your opponent somewhere between 3 and 650 gold per turn, because they're getting no income out of the damn thing, or close to nothing out of what would normally be a very profitable province, and they can't recruit anything out of what is usually a very productive province, and they can't recruit their cap onlys. This makes things like blights and hurricanes instantly attractive when dealing with enemy capitals. They're also relatively cheap. Let's compare them to each other. Blight is minus 5% population and 80 gold. units. Now, if this is a one-on-one game, that -80 gold's actually reasonable because that's a exchange rate that's relatively equal to alchemy. You gain 15 to 20 gold, between 10 and 20 gold per gem if you alchemize into gold. This is spending 5 gems to take 80 gold away from your opponent. So even if it had no other effect, like, it's something. But really, 80 gold, not so sure that's worth it. But it's something. 15 unrest is not nothing, and 5% population is not nothing. It's pretty soft. It can get annoying if it's cast turn after turn, but it's pretty soft touch. At the same time, it's only 5 Earth Gems, and it's E2, Death 1, and it comes early at Alt 4, and if you're going to Alt 4, you're probably going up Alt anyway, because there's better stuff there, so you're probably just getting this incidentally. One thing I will note about this and almost all of these spells is they'll have cannot target same province more than once per turn, which means don't cast this more than once at the same province in a turn. The second cast won't do anything. It's just wasting gems, which also means you can't spend 50 Earth Gems in order to get 150 Unrest, unfortunately. Hurricane ditches the -80 gold, saves a little bit of the population, and think of population as permanent unrest financially. You're losing permanent income and rec points from a province rather than temporary like you are with unrest, which can slowly go down over time. So less long-term hit, but much more short-term kick. Significant increase. And if you're an air nation, you might have air 3. People like Calum, if you were going Thunderstrike, air magic, then you're going to have A3 and you're going to go to at least Evo 4. In fact, you're going to go to Evo 5. So you're going to have Hurricane. 5 air gems is still not 5 full-sized air elementals you're casting in a battle, which I think is why most air nations don't use a lot of hurricanes. 5 full-size air elementals, probably going to do more. But if you're willing to spend 25 air gems on this, chain casting it for 5 turns in a row, you can probably shut down enemy capital recruitment if they're not a nation that can easily patrol or doesn't want to brutally patrol their capital back into shape. Hurricane is the first of these spells that has a reasonable potential to shut down enemy capital. Then we move on to spells that don't increase unrest, but instead mess with the enemy scales in some way. I won't deal with that. Let's deal with Melancholy. I don't know why I had that one there. It's not really worth talking about in this context. So, Melancholia. Melancholia is an interesting one because I covered it in army killing spells. Because it imposes this all units in province take MR check V10, morale check V10. If they fail both, they desert. Which is nifty. Usually not worth 20 Earth Gems because most things won't fail this. However, if your enemy is making a final stand in their capital, Melancholia might have a point if you don't think you're going to be able to dig them out quickly, because it has 2 secondary effects. It sets Sloth to 3, and it reduces Dominion Candles by 1 to 2, which gives Melancholia 2 technical secondary uses. Against an enemy who is highly cap dependent, who is highly resource dependent on their cap units, or requires shit tons of resources just to recruit their commanders. So, I don't know, if you're coming up against really resource-intensive giants, for example. There are certain types like Anakim. The good Anakim are very resource-intensive. Adons are very resource-intensive. The problem is by the time you get to Thaum 6, people have better options. But if your opponent is resource-reliant in their capital, Sloth 3 might hurt their recruitment a lot, as in more than halve it. The other thing is, there are very few ways to directly reduce Dominion Candles, and this is an example of one of them. Spells that reduce Dominion Candles are useful if you are trying to dom kill someone. They're probably not useful otherwise, but they're useful if you're trying to dom kill someone. So if you are targeting someone's capital, you're trying to preach it down, but they've got their temple, they've got their capital check, so getting that thing preached down and broken and pressed is difficult. A direct 1 to 2 candle nuke per turn might make the difference in getting them down to 0. Might. Manipulating scales is something to be done thoughtfully because of how gem intensive it can be relative to what it does. Once we get upper level, we go from Alt 4, Evo 4 to Blood 5, Thou 5. Suddenly shit starts to get real pretty quickly. It doesn't take long into the Ascension Wars before mages figure out that they can really screw with their enemies once the proverbial Geneva Convention is removed. Fire magic and, importantly, blood magic gain the ability to do some pretty significant damage. And this is, well, let's talk about them and then talk about why the blood spells in particular are really problematic, but Raging Hearts deserves to be noted. Raging Hearts is a Fire 4 spell at Thalm 5. So the number of nations that can easily cast this, it's not huge, but for example, anyone who can get to a Flame Spirit can do Raging Hearts. They probably just can't do it at the same time they're hitting Thalm 5 early on. But there are nations that can do this without too much trouble. And for nations that can't do this without too much trouble, the right indies will do it. So the adepts of the Pyriflegaton, for example, the Fire 3 recruitables with a booster are in. For 10 fire gems, so twice as much as Blight and whatnot, you get minus 5% population, you get 60 unrest, and it is reported as a random event. All of these spells at this level, by the way, in fact, all the spells I'm going to talk about from here on out are reported as random events. That means you can dump 60% unrest on an enemy capital, and no one can prove it was you. Now, if there's only one or two people with fire magic that can cast it, you might have a lot of suspicion. But it's pretty long range. You start with 5 provinces. You can get 6 range out of fire spells by just giving them the stick. Giving them a little flame focus stick, which gets you to 6 provinces. 6 provinces is a long way. So this has results. Let's talk about the military purposes, the diplomatic purposes. The diplomatic purposes can be for all of them. I may as well cover the other spells and then talk about, because they all do basically the same thing. Wrath of Pazuzu, Blood 1, Air 3, 35 unrest, minus 4% population, random event. Reign of Toads, 40 unrest, 3 misfortune, 4% disease chance for soldiers, all soldiers in the province, reported as a random event. 20 blood slaves, 15 blood slaves, 10 fire gems, all good spells. So, what are the military purposes of these spells? What are the diplomatic purposes of this spell? So, militarily, these are the spells at which, realistically, you can pile enough unrest on a capital to close it down without the enemy being able to patrol it down each turn without nuking their population pretty bloody quickly, and keeping a significant army on their capital in order to do that patrolling. And if they do that, if it's a big chaffy army of shit that's designed to patrol, you drop one appropriately geared thug on it, it'll kill the entire thing, and you've destroyed all their summons, and they're getting unrested again. So these spells can put them in a bind for the first time if they are a capital reliant nation. Some of the very, very good nations in the game are extremely dependent on their cap-only mages or their cap-only recruitables. If, for example, Late Age Atlantis has their capital unrest locked and cannot recruit the larger Ungakok, then they're in trouble. So militarily, this is a shut down the enemy capital spell. The population loss is secondary, but will mount quite quickly. 3 casts of a minus 5% population spell doesn't remove 15%, but it does remove relatively close to that, which is something. You might knock 20 to 30 gold per turn in population off, but you're also nuking the income with those sort of unrest numbers. They are not getting anywhere near their usual value from that population. Finally, Reign of Toads has the extra additional value that there is a chance to disease, a small chance but a non-zero chance to disease all the units in the province, which means if there is a giant stack patrolling it down, 4% attrition. May or may not matter depending on what sort of units are stationed there. So, militarily, this is about shutting down a capital. probably temporarily, probably because you want to freeze recruitment. Diplomatically, this is great for starting wars between people. Or doing shitty stuff in a deniable fashion. So, if you can cast one of these spells, and there is at least one other person that can cast it, who could also be in range, then if you are smart, you might be able to use this to raise uncertainty. That's one purpose. This is especially useful if you shouldn't be able to cast the spell but can. So if, for example, you are a non-fire nation who has lucked into Fire 3 mages, as long as you keep that mage not on your border and you don't think enemy scouts are going to get onto that province, and you give them a flame stick and you start nuking people, then maybe they think Abyssir or Raga or whoever is doing it instead. And you can cause you can cause pain to someone, and you might be able to coach the diplomatic game your way. The other option, if you're me and you don't like that kind of skullduggery, but I've seen that kind of skullduggery done with reasonable effect, is you can use these as a deterrent, because they're a way to guarantee your opponent that you will inflict a certain amount of damage on them. So even if you are completely militarily overmatched, this allows you to go one step beyond the, hey, look, I'm going to burn down all my labs and I'm going to pillage all my own provinces if you attack, so you're not going to get much out of me. It goes one step further in saying, oh, and by the way, your capital will be recruitment frozen for the 12 or 14 turns or however long it takes for you to kill my last mage, and that's going to cost you a lot and may impact whether or not other people will likely attack you. So, you can recruitment lock people for military advantage. You can threaten to recruitment lock people or to nuke their capital incomes for deterrence purposes, or you can be a shit about it, do it, not tell anyone you're doing it, and try and start some sort of shenanigans with the anonymous. Remembering that if you're going to blame someone else, they need to be someone who can cast the spell and can get a mage in range, and preferably has motive in order to do it. If, for example, you do it, try and frame someone, and they can send a verifiable screenshot that they don't have Thalm 5 unlocked, then they probably didn't use Raging Hearts. Yeah, so if you're going to do that sort of stuff, be smart about it, and try not to think too much about the morality of it. But in terms of the usefulness of these spells against each other, Raging Hearts is the most powerful because 60 Unrest is the hardest to patrol through, but 10 Fire Gems is worth a lot more than 20 Blood Slaves. And the 20 Blood Slaves also comes with the added point of the Misfortune Scales, and the Disease Chance. So Reign of Toads, cast at a reasonable scale, can get very annoying for people very, very quickly, because a sufficiently powerful Blood Nation can shut down more than one province if they need to. If, for example, they know you have a critical indie province from which you're recruiting maybe it's your Garnet province. It's your only source of blood mages. They don't want you to have blood mages. Bang, Reign of Toad says, after an investment of 40 blood slaves of theirs, and maybe another 20 every 3 or 4 turns, no blood mages for you. So it has a purpose. But all of these are characterized by relative efficiency, long range, anonymity, and reasonably high unrest boosts. There is a final category of province killing spells right at the end of the scale, and they both come in Evo 9. One is Water 5, one is Fire 4, Earth 3. Tidal Wave and Volcanic Eruption. These spells look really, really cool, and they can be cool, but they have some drawbacks. Let's talk about the cool first. Tidal Wave is an anonymous event with a range of 6 provinces. And if you're at Evo 9, you can probably spring for the water boosters to get the +1 ritual range from the lens and take that to range 7. With an elemental mastery staff, if you have one, you can take that to range 8. And range 8 means you can put something just about anywhere. May only be cast from underwater, and may only target coastal provinces. Pretty sure. This doesn't say it can only target coastal provinces, but I could have sworn it could only target coastal provinces. Anyway, for 15 water gems, you inflict 50 unrest, which is a worse trade than Raging Hearts. The difference is the pop kill is 30% instead of 5. So a third of the population of a province is gone. This means for 30 water gems, you can kill, let's work this out, 30% of 70%, 740, 21, you can kill 51%. You can kill more than half of the people in a province for 30 water gems over 2 turns. So if someone's got a late game capital that's been running growth 3 the entire game, they're getting about 700 gold a turn out of it. Not even accounting the unrest, you've got a permanent reduction of 350, and it's unrest locked or close to if it hasn't been patrolled down. So Tidal Wave and Volcanic Eruption 2 hit really, really hard. They're limited by being A, Evo 9, and B, High Path. Tidal Wave's actually pretty reasonable to cast because it's easy to boost water, especially at the point where you're hitting Evo 9, right? And a lot of the nations that want to hit Evo 9 are nations that are going to be able to boost to 5 water anyway. Or they're going to have big fire magic, which means Volcanic Eruption might be on the cards for them, because they might be looking for things like flames from the sky if you're going Evo 9 as a fire nation. So Water 5, you can boost there, you can put on the chest piece, put on the bracelet. Water 3 base is good enough. Tidal Wave, if your enemy capital is coastal, and you didn't have fire, well, you can probably unrest lock them, but you can also just destroy the capital. You can just get rid of the recruitment points forever. If you're in a long, drawn-out hell war with someone, you can take their cap recruitment out of the game permanently. Or if you're not in a war and you would like someone to be in a war, it is anonymous and it is very long range. But again, 15 water gems is fairly expensive. You could get for a couple of casts this, you could get something like a Naiad, which might be very useful, or some later full water summons. But 30% population is a pretty big chunk to take out of enemy capital, especially anonymously. I can see it being used, and I considered using it in a game. In fact, it is in one of the games that you guys would currently be watching, the Disciples one. I consider the use of Tidal Wave. Unfortunately, I reject its use because Evo 9 isn't made a priority early enough, but it is considered. Volcanic Eruption is more flexible but not as good. Still kills 30% of the population. It's still a random event. It's still range 6. Fire still has an easy booster to get you to 7, or even 8 if you... no, you can't. You can go 7. Range 7 easily with this. You might have to think a little harder about how to get to range 8, but the difference is you don't have to cast it from underwater and you don't have to target coastal. So you can target any land province. In fact, I'm pretty sure you can target underwater province too. The difference is you only get 30 unrest rather than 50, which is considerably less. The population kill of 30% is still so significant that after 2 casts, a capital will essentially be a good ordinary province. After 3 casts, it will be in very, very bad shape, and after 4, it is almost worthless, which later in the game may be worth it, depending on how capital dependent your opponent is at that stage in the game. Again, the same uses apply hypothetically as to Pazuzu, Rain of Toads, Raging Heart, those sort of level 5 spells. You can wrecklock people to gain an advantage in a conflict. The difference is here, you are not going to get a very valuable capital out of them at the end because you've killed everyone who lives there. You've killed the tax base. And if there's no one to pay your taxes, you don't get any taxes. So probably not a great long-term strategy there. It's like area bombing a city that you want to occupy. Maybe not. Maybe not. And there are more efficient ways to get unrest. If you can cast Volcanic Eruption, you can cast Raging Hearts and unrest lock someone quicker and cheaper if you don't want to kill the population and still be a random event. Tidal Wave is there if you don't have if you can't Raging Hearts or Blood, so you get an option. It's there. So recruitment locking, maybe not as much. Good deterrent if someone is cap dependent, like killing off half the population of their capital in 2 turns, and that's not something they're going to be able to likely be able to stop quickly. Yeah, that's a pretty good deterrent, and it's a nice way to screw with people anonymously, being able to blow up people's capitals is fun. Is fun. It's horrifying, but it's also it's enjoyable in a sense, and it lets you have some fun with late game dominions. I think Volcanic Eruption and Tidal Wave are held back more than anything by the fact that they are at Evo 9, and who goes Evo 9? And by the time you go Evo 9, are you really fighting people that are capital dependent? At that point, the survivors of a game will usually have large empires. They will have eaten 2, maybe 3 neighbors. So they'll have 3 capitals in their empire. They'll be on gem economies, so they won't be reliant on their capital-only recruits. So unrest locking them is not as much of a problem. And big empires also mean getting range on an enemy capital is a little bit harder. I think a lot more use is going to come out of the middle of the road spells. It's going to be Pazuzu, it's going to be Rain of Toads, it's going to be Raging Hearts. And then in the early game, people have gotten use out of Blight and Hurricane. So now that we've looked at the spells, how does this sort of track over the course of the game? Well, a lot of these spells come pretty early. 4 and 5 are pretty early in their respective paths, although Blood is more specialized. Alteration, getting you Wolven Winter and Blight, handy. Unrest locking someone's capital with Blight is not super reasonable, but at the same time I've absolutely seen it done. Unrest locking someone with Hurricane, absolutely doable. And level 4 research is something that happens early enough in the game that you might be coming up against nations who are literally going into their first wars that only have their capitals. They may be cap-dependent nations, and if so, unrest locking capital recruitment early on can matter. You just need a plan for if your opponent is going to deploy a bunch of patrollers in order to get that unrest back under control, so they can stay operational, if that makes sense. Adjusting scales is niche. So Misfortune 3 on Reign of Toads, that's got very niche applicability. Slothing to 3, I think we discussed that, niche applicability. Wolven Winter and Breath of the Desert can be really important if you're going into a battle which is temperature dependent, but that's still a form of niche relevance. All of these indirectly affect economies, but in small temporary ways. So just think about why you're Wolven Wintering or Breath of the Deserting. Don't just do it to the enemy capital for shits and gigs. Probably don't just do it for the gold alone. But if you are a cold nation attacking someone who has heat auras, or someone who's cold-blooded, or vice versa, you are a cold-blooded nation attacking like LA Atlantis or Niflheim or whatever, by all means, manipulate the shit out of those scales. When you get into the unrest manipulators, the blood ones let you go industrial, because with blood you can go industrial. And blood 5 is not super hard to get to. The problem is you don't normally go blood first as any nation, even a blood nation. But if you can access these spells, and they're a little bit odd in terms of pathing, Reign of Toads and Pazuzu, no, we're not seeing a huge spread of mages that can do this, but if you can, this is a reasonable mechanism to unrest lock. Raging Hearts is accessible for certain nations and will absolutely unrest lock an enemy capital pretty bloody quickly. As I said, just get ready to clear off the inevitable response of patrollers. Keep it in mind if you are facing an enemy who is capital dependent. Finally, Volcanic Eruption and Tidal Wave show the Ascension wars that are taking the gloves off, and you start killing population. So it's better for long, drawn-out wars where permanent economic damage is acceptable, but unfortunately, by the point at which these spells get out, permanent gold damage probably isn't as relevant. It's gems that are deciding the game at that point, and big clashing armies and super combatants. And if you're at Evo 9, you could be using your fire gems to destroy 50% of an army with flames from the sky. Nuking research parks. You could be using your water gems on all kinds of things. So they have niche applicability. But all of those unrest spells, the level 5s and the level 9s, have the ability to manipulate diplomacy, both by scaring people off and framing others, injuring people with temporary recruitment locks during conflicts, and also doing, I suppose you could say they also later do damage to an opponent without technically declaring war, as long as you don't have a nap that prevents the use of ritual spells. So, I think that's a good summary. How much do I use these? The answer is a medium amount to not much. They are not my favorite sort of ritual spell. I'll use a lot more army killers than I'll use province targeting spells, but that's because I have never been in a to the death struggle with a cap dependent nation at a point where I have access to these spells. If I had Raging Hearts and I was in a battle against a capital dependent nation, then I would use it. Absolutely, in a heartbeat. If I was up against a nation that was really reliant on that sort of stuff. If I was fighting Raga, I would Raging Hearts there or Wolven Winter their capital. Absolutely, every day of the week. Shut that shit down. I just haven't been put in that position much. I have seen people use Blight. I have seen people use Reign of Toads, and I've seen 1 or 2 uses of Hurricane, and I've seen lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of Wolven Winter by cold nations moving into heat nations. These spells, final word, these spells infuriate people more than they hurt them. Like Bane Venom Charms. Someone anonymously, permanently killing the population of your province and causing unrest. Someone doing permanent damage to you in a way that is almost impossible to counter for the purposes of just spite is really, really tilting. So when you go to deploy these spells, consider their tilt potential and factor that into your game plan. Factor in the fact that people who have this used on them will be affronted that you have used on them. You're probably not likely to get a peace deal out of them. And you may cause them to be a little more aggressive than they otherwise would be, but you're certainly guaranteed to get more annoyance out of an opponent than you otherwise would. So, in summary, before breaking out the WMDs of the Dominions universe, think twice, but if you do use them, these are a significant tool that can be used especially effectively against nations with either particular scale preferences in the form of temperature, or against people who are capital dependent and as a result really suffer if you unrest lock their capital income and their capital recruitability. And finally, at the end of the game, give you attempts to go on power trips and literally deploy the equivalent of nuclear weapons, killing 30% of the population of a province every time. So, that's by my standards, relatively short video on province-destroying spells. Happy to expand on this one. We'll let you know as soon as I've got the games folder sorted out and ready to start posting again. I'm really keen to get that Disciples game running again, as well as the others. And in the meantime, I'm going to be producing guide videos too, because I've just missed the Dominion stuff too much. And I was like, I have to come back and do something, even if my save files aren't organized. Hope this was an interesting topic. See you all.